What does it mean to haunt something? Ghosts, ghouls, goths hanging out in a cemetery, memories of people? In real life, this is kind of complicated, but in stories, a lot more is possible. So what does it mean to haunt a story itself? I couldn't find any definitions online for what it truly means to haunt a narrative, but I'm sure if you clicked on this video, you already have an idea. It's a character, a concept, or a memory that affects the story long after its moment has passed. In fact, the absence of it seems to be more important than its presence was in the first place. The most famous example of a character that does this is Laura Palmer from Twin Peaks, and we'll talk about her in a minute, but there's tons of other characters that do this in all kinds of stories, from books to movies to TV shows, and even in video games too. In this video, I focus on around half a dozen, but there's probably 10 times that. There's Laura Palmer, Rachel Amber, Alison Dilaurentis, Jackie Taylor, the girls from Virgin Suicides, Rose Quartz from Steven Universe, Rose Tyler from Doctor Who, Adrian's Dead Mom in Miraculous, Joel Miller in The Last of Us, Lucy Gray Baird, Hannah Baker, Alaska Young, ... And if I didn't mention any that you particularly like, feel free to tell me in the comments. But, if you didn't notice, there's only one man mentioned in that entire list. Almost all of the characters within this trope end up being women. And why is that? Is it just another way of silencing women and female characters? Or is it empowering because not even death can stop these women from influencing the story around them? Well, we'll figure that out, but first, let's have a look of who our haunting ladies are and why I picked them. Laura Palmer is the prime example of a character that haunts the narrative. Yes, it existed before her, but Twin Peaks was the first piece of fiction and pop culture to really do it like this. Not only that, but Laura Palmer went on to inspire dozens of other characters and stories for years to come. So I'm using her as a reference on what it should mean, within the confines of this video, to haunt the narrative. In doing this, I've come up with 3 little rules for my criteria. Rule number 1, the character has to be absent longer than they were present. Rule number 2, this absence is way more important than their presence in one way or another. And rule number 3, this character's absence moves the plot forward or character development forward significantly. Therefore, characters that just die tragically and are grieved don't really count. Characters that die at the end or near the end don't count either, and characters that were present at some point can still count though. After all, Laura Palmer is still alive in the entire Fire Walk With Me movie, right? Going back to her, it's not surprising that she was one of the most influential figures in this trope. Her character writing is phenomenal. Even while she's dead, especially while she's dead actually, she's pushing the plot forward more than anything else in the show. She not only haunts her loved ones because of their grief, but the detective investigating her death, and pretty much the entire rest of the town. Another very prominent part of her character is how she has this complete double life that nobody really expected from her. This aspect of Laura Palmer specifically went on to inspire many other characters, some of which we'll get into in a bit. All of these secrets that she kept, when you look back on it, are fairly believable, too. I mean, she must have had one hell of a day planner, but many of her bad habits seem more like pretty fair reactions to her monstrously awful life. Spoiler warning for an almost 40-year-old show, but the main ones are that she does coke, had like 5 boyfriends, and fell into being a lady of the night, because I don't know what I'm not allowed to say on here. All while she had a job, high school classes, and plenty of other stuff to keep her busy. And she's 17. Hypersexuality is a fairly common response type, or at least a fairly believable response, to the type of trauma that Laura Palmer went through. Not only that, but the way that the show navigated this aspect to her was in a very compassionate way. She wasn't objectified because of it, and it wasn't turned into a joke either. Instead, Laura Palmer in her story is meant to be a figure in the greater tale of generational trauma within Twin Peaks, and how many lives it can ruin when you don't get help to stop the cycle. It can also be used as a critique of that bystander effect and the cruelty of it. There were so many people who saw her suffering in one way or another and did nothing about it. As the show goes on and things take a more experimental sci-fi turn, I personally think that Laura Palmer's story blends pretty well into Bob and all of the other supernatural parts. It's a very abstract way to comment on all of those themes that I just mentioned, but it works. So all in all, I love Laura Palmer. I only recently started getting into Twin Peaks, but she's quickly turning into one of my favorite fictional characters maybe ever. Before Laura Palmer, though, I still loved the haunting the narrative trope. It was just with other characters. Both Rachel Amber and Alison Dilaurentis were very directly inspired by Laura Palmer. Pretty Little Liars and Life is Strange, respectively, don't shy away from making references to Twin Peaks, especially when it comes to these two characters. Because of this strong inspiration, there are many similarities between the two characters, so let's start with the good parts. Both Alison and Rachel do an extremely good job of pushing the plot forward without being physically present at all, for the most part. They push their remaining friends to investigate more into their lives until not even their closest friends recognize who these girls even were anymore. Life is Strange and Pretty Little Liars both played into the ideas of perception. Everyone perceives Alison and Rachel differently, to the point where the main audience, and at times even the characters, don't even know who they are. I've talked about this a lot, and I have an entire video dedicated to this phenomenon with Rachel Amber specifically. But I think both of these pieces of media also go into something else I haven't mentioned, and something unique from Twin Peaks' Laura Palmer: betrayal. With Alison, it's fairly obvious. Alison was awful. She was cruel, she had pretty much no remorse for hurting other people's feelings, and it seemed that her favorite hobbies were blackmailing anyone she spoke to and then fat-shaming her closest friends. Clearly, she's a delight. Rachel, on the other hand, is a lot more nuanced. She's not really considered a mean girl, but instead that star student that everybody else looked up to. Even someone as abrasive and untrusting as Chloe Price can be at times. Then, halfway through the first game, we find out that Rachel was very different to the mental image we build up across the game. Chloe Price makes her sound like her dead wife, with like the coolest, sweetest girl you'd ever meet, and then the realization that she's not slaps her and Max and you across the face. She was sleeping with a man behind Chloe's back. Then, again, at the same time, it's a grown man. Frank Bowers is a huge creep. He was preying on Rachel, just like Mark Jefferson was, and don't forget, he helped Nathan Prescott prey on probably like half the school, too. So was Rachel really betraying Chloe, or was she just a victim in more ways than we anticipated? Alison Dilaurentis was also a victim of creepy old men, and even more than Rachel had for dating after her, including 3 cops and 2 teachers, so some could say her insane behavior was a reaction to a lot of stuff going on in her life, to put it kindly. Does this excuse what she does? I don't really know. But clearly, these characters are not perfectly written. Rachel Amber's faults are pretty easy to sum up with the plot holes with Him Before the Storm, and then a pretty bad representation of her in this prequel just in general. And then on the other hand, Alison is more of a complicated case that I haven't talked about at all yet. Her writing in the first couple seasons in Pretty Little Liars was actually pretty good, for the show at least. Then things kind of fall apart. It doesn't help that they bring the character back from the dead in a way that makes absolutely no sense when you think about it for more than 5 seconds. And then there's her whole last day before she went missing, where she did like 80 different things in the span of 3 hours. Forget Laura Palmer's day planner, I want to know how Alison was tracking her time. How did she manage to do all that? But anyways, I think the worst part about Alison's character writing goes a little bit more meta. In these later seasons, where she's actually alive and more present than just being a dead girl, the actress happened to gain weight. Not that it needs an explanation, but Alison's actress, Sasha, has PCOS, which causes weight gain that can be really hard to control. She tried to, probably due to pressure from producers, but it just wasn't possible. And what are the writers gonna do? Let a mean girl not be skinny? What the hell is that for? So they make her into this weird, lobotomized, like, loser who doesn't really do anything and lets people walk all over her. Anyways, in the grand scheme of things, both Alison Dilaurentis and Rachel Amber actually present really unique aspects of the haunting the narrative trope. They introduce a lot of the moral ambiguity that hasn't really been introduced in pop culture before, at least in this video. We're pretending. Their victimhood turns into a topic of debate, into a question of how far these characters can go while still being considered innocent or justifiable in their actions. Can victims be bad people too? Are these girls bad people? I don't know. You tell me. But where does this trope progress past this? In the terms of the video, it's actually into one of my favorite genres, psychological horror. I've seen very little appreciation for these women and teenage girl. when talking about characters that haunt the narrative, but I think they're really good examples of how far the trope and plot device has come since 1990 and before then. Mary Sunderland, the wife of protagonist James Sunderland in Silent Hill 2, is easy to recognize as a good pick if you know of her. She caused the entire plot to start as James apparently received a letter from her saying that she's in the Silent Hill town. He's then haunted by her both metaphorically and quite literally in all of the characters and monsters that he encounters on the way to try and find his wife. One of my first ever videos talks about the symbolism in Silent Hill 2 and the character psychology in James Sunderland, and I'll probably end up redoing this at some point too, so if I did, you'll see it in that little info card thing. Anyways, Sayori from Doki Doki Literature Club, on the other hand, is really not mentioned in this conversation at all. But I think she's a really cool character that haunts the narrative. Yes, she is technically present for like a third of the story, but her absence marks a very abrupt turn into that psychological horror that the game is very well known for. Her death is one of the most famous plot twists in horror games of all time, and then the protagonist keeps on going into the game in search of where she went. When you compare Mary and Sayori side by side, though, they actually have a lot in common. Both of them push a male protagonist forward to either avenge, help, or find them. In fact, it's these male protagonists' romantic interest in these ladies that ultimately doom them in the first place. Their deaths are also framed as really excellent plot twists and provide a reinvention of the pre-existing haunting format. Usually we're already well aware that these characters are dead, but in these games their deaths are a key part of the horror, especially because both protagonists are dead for way longer than the protagonist and the audience expected. In the grand scheme of things, both characters were doomed from the beginning. Mary's dead before the events of the game even start. Her body's in James's car. Sayori is fated to die as soon as you start playing the game, but it wasn't meant to be this way for either of them. Both characters had other paths ready for them to follow. Mary was meant to die from her sickness. She didn't. Sayori was meant to go to the festival with the protagonist. She also didn't. Their fates were instead changed by the other characters within the story. And then, the overall story was manipulated by these characters so that the audience was none the wiser for much of the game. This manipulation in Silent Hill 2 specifically is a great example of abusers and their victims. We play the game from the objectively bad guy's perspective. We only perceive Mary in the way that James, her killer and low-key abuser, sees her. I saw a really good video on this months ago. I'll link it in the description for anybody who wants to check it out. It's about Silent Hill 2 and mouthwashing in this sort of sense. Sayori and Doki Doki Literature Club, on the other hand, instead got very existential and philosophical in the later half of the story, instead of being a psychological think piece on abuse. This twist is actually a lot like Twin Peaks' second half of their story, if you really think about it. But I don't think Twin Peaks was an inspiration for DDLC at all. And as time went on, media moved past that Twin Peaks revival, and as we continue moving, we turn into more of a contemporary phase. Okay, now really hear me out. I know Jinx isn't a character that haunts the narrative, like, at all, but I think Powder is a really unique example of this trope, if you argued about it in a certain way, which I am clearly very happy to do. Powder and Jinx within Arcane are treated as two entirely separate characters for the most part. Different names, different personalities, and different relationships. In fact, Silco really seems to push this narrative in Season 1 specifically. For all intents and purposes, for Jinx to exist, Powder had to die, metaphorically. And then, after the time skip in Season 1, Powder not only haunts Jinx, but Vi as well. So maybe it's not a character death that haunts the absence, but a symbolic identity death instead, ego death. Powder was Jinx's innocence, so when she quote-unquote dies, it's to illustrate Jinx letting go of her childhood innocence and facing her more volatile future. Jackie Taylor from Yellow Jackets also has a very symbolic death and haunting in the show, except instead of innocence, her death is to show the collapsing of the social order within the group. Power based on influence means nothing when you're trapped in the woods and starving to death. When Jackie dies, and everything that happens to Jackie afterward, it's a point of no return for the girls. Even if they got rescued the day after that, they could never turn back into the girls that they were before the crash. They were tainted. However, neither Jackie nor Powder's death really pushes the plot forward in big ways. If anything, they're the effects of the plot fence. So why did I put them in here? I think that their effects on characters' development are way more important than what they mean for the plot, to put it simply. This is especially true for Powder. While Powder's metaphorical death means little to the story beats themselves, it's a lingering factor in many of the characters' actions. Jinx is torn between wanting to find Vi and have her family back, and then establishing her own identity and growing up, in the way specifically Silco encourages her to. Vi feels tremendously guilty over what happened to Powder and spends the entire first season trying to track her down to get her back. And then when she finds out who Powder is, she's torn between wanting to help Powder and having to keep Jinx responsible for her actions. Powder haunts both of them. For Jackie, she haunts Shauna the most. That's kind of obvious with the hallucinations and Shauna's extreme denial after Jackie died and all of that. However, Jackie also haunts all of the girls in one way or another, especially during the hunts. Shauna is the one to put Jackie's heart necklace on anyone chosen for the hunt, symbolizing how they'll follow in her footsteps. Another similarity between Powder and Jackie is that both of them, in a sense, can be considered morally gray, or at least there's debates over their morals and their actions by the audience. Technically, Powder is at fault for killing her entire family, and Jackie contributed very little to the group's survival before she died, only adding to the growing disconnect between her and the group. In the end, though, I think both of these girls are just placed in situations and circumstances that they didn't deserve, and they clearly couldn't really survive in. However, this phase of the trope isn't without its flaws either. I quite like Jackie's writing and how it's navigated throughout the show, but my real problem here is with Jinx and Powder, specifically in Season 2. I've mentioned before that I'm not a fan of Season 2, and while we're on the topic of Powder, I personally really dislike how she was handled in the alternate universe in Season 2 of Arcane. Instead of really going into what Jinx could have been and the life that she could have had, which would have been so interesting, they just turned her into some manic pixie dream girl for Echo. Like, they go into Powder's, like, possible life a little bit, but I feel like there's so much missed potential that they could have had. It just erases so much depth to her character. She turns into some cliche instead of being a very three-dimensional woman like she is in Season 1, and I guess the alternate universe, although I still have some complaints about how Jinx is written in Season 2 overall. Then again, you could argue that this whole entire trope of haunting the narrative also turns female characters into some sort of cliche, but I disagree. Like I said at the beginning of this video, almost all of the famous characters within this trope, whether I have or haven't mentioned them, are typically women. Why is this? Is it just to silence them? Is it to give male characters more development through grieving some woman in their life? Personally, I don't think so. In fact, I think quite the opposite. Having so many women haunt narratives like this can be quite empowering if you really think about it. I can't think of a single other genre or trope in fiction that enables men specifically to care so much about a woman. Not even in romance. When a girl haunts the narrative, she's all-consuming, she's all-important, she's all you can think about. And oftentimes, she's all the male protagonists can think about. She influences their actions in ways they can't even register. James Sunderland, Silco, Detective Cooper, the main character in Doki Doki Literature Club, Nathan Prescott, Frank Bowers, the list goes on. Even when she's not there, she's still controlling what happens. As for why all of the most significant haunting the narrative characters are women, I think it's a reinvention of other tropes that lean into very misogynistic undertones. For example, the dead wife trope and even the manic pixie dream girl. Many times, fiction and media will treat women as a device, as a tool, as something to use to either progress the writer's story or further the male characters in some way. For example, Manic Pixie Dream Girls will teach a depressed male MC how to really enjoy life. And then the dead wife is really just like a way to get older men characters depressed and sad, I guess. Past that, these female characters will have little to no development, power, or agency. But many of the characters in this trope, the haunting the narrative, will take that erasure of women's voices and turn it into their own development. Take Laura Palmer, for example. Her entire story is a reflection of the way that men can hurt and silence women to the point where she felt completely powerless in life. She was literally daydreaming of angels coming to save her because she knew she couldn't do anything for herself to help her situation. And then, in death, she found a sort of freedom from all that. Additionally, instead it was the men within Twin Peaks, especially Leland, Palmer, her father, and Dale Cooper, the detective, that cannot stop thinking about her. She haunts them now, instead of men haunting her. Many of the characters in this list and trope are victims in similar senses, and refreshingly, this trope gives a sort of agency to the women in these kinds of stories that they otherwise might not get. For example, many people frame the storm at the end of Life is Strange to be Rachel Amber's revenge on the town for her fate. Above all, this trope is often very adept at portraying just how haunting it is to be a woman. No matter how powerful or outgoing or strong you might seem to others, you can still end up being that photo on a missing poster that people just walk past. But as for now, that's all I have the time for today. Before ending this video, though, I'd love to hear what you guys think. Do you disagree about the larger forces at play behind this trope? Are there other characters that I should have mentioned, or do you disagree with the ones that I picked? Tell me in the comments. Either way, thank you so much for watching. I'm a small channel, so even support like watching this video all the way through helps me a lot. Also, since you did watch this all the way through, I highly recommend subscribing so you don't miss any of my future uploads. I really love talking about this stuff, so make sure you don't miss out. But until then, I'll see you.